Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Amy Messersmith, Chief People Officer here at Builders FirstSource, and I'm honored to welcome you to our third and final Market Intelligence webinar of the year. Before we dive into the insights our team and Allie Wolf have prepared, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the immense challenges many of you are facing in the wake of Hurricanes Helene and Milton. The devastation caused by these storms has been profound, but so has the resilience we've witnessed in the communities impacted. At Builders FirstSource, we take pride in being a national company that makes a local impact. And in the face of these storms, that commitment is more important than ever. Like many of you, our team members are actively supporting recovery efforts, leveraging their personal knowledge of their communities and working closely with local organizations to help rebuild. We are proud of the positive impact we've made so far, but we recognize there is still so much work to do. Builders FirstSource is here for the long haul, standing alongside you, our partners, as we navigate this recovery together. Today's webinar will offer valuable perspectives that we hope will help you navigate these trying times. Thank you again for being here, and let's get started. I'd now like to introduce Tim Page, our Executive Vice President of Digital Solutions. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Amy. I'll start with a quick update on digital solutions. The goal of our digital initiative is to make it easier for home builders to do business with our company while also providing tools that help you gain efficiencies within your processes. MyBLDR.com provides transparency to our customers by providing storage of home plans, the ability to request an estimate across all BFS product categories, review quotes, purchase material, track deliveries, review invoices, and make payments online. But MyBLDR.com goes way beyond that with full collaborative project management capabilities for home buyer selections, construction scheduling, budgeting, and much more. We introduced MyBLDR.com earlier this year at the International Builders Show and now have over 10,000 customer users leveraging it each month. If you're not one of them, I encourage you to check it out, talk to your BFS sales representative or local digital sales specialist to learn more. The next slide highlights the configure module within MyBLDR.com, which is our integrated home buyer selection tool. Configure provides photorealistic exterior and interior 3D visualizations with the ability to easily compare different designs. Within Configure, home builders are able to select the products they want to offer their home buyers from our national catalog, which includes thousands of manufacturer products, styles, and colors. If you're not ready to move your business to 3D, you can now also leverage our free selection book to work with your home buyer to capture the 100+ selections needed on your projects. Home builders can also add their own product content to include selections that may not yet be available in our catalog. You'll find the new selection process takes just minutes to set up, is easy to use, and will improve home buyer engagement in your design process. Finally, I'd like to highlight the 24-episode series we're doing with Matt Reisinger in the Build Show. Matt is recognized as an expert in our space. He's an expert in building science, high-performance construction. He's leveraging our BFS ReadyFrame product and digital tools in completing this project, which is already available for you to purchase through the BFS Home Plan Library. The series gives you the opportunity to learn more about innovative products from our supply partners that are available through BFS, as well as the proper installation of those products. Please check out episode number 13, which explores best practices for installing exterior trim and cladding, as well as Matt's most recent podcast, which explains how advancements in digital tools improve home builder operations. We will be taking part in the Build Show live event in Austin, Texas from November 7th to the 9th. If you're attending, please be sure to stop by the home tour and our trade show booth to learn more. Thank you again for joining today's webinar. I'll now turn it over to Brett Dewey, our Vice President of Supply Chain for Millwork.
Good afternoon. I'd like to provide a quick update on the port strike that included all Gulf and East Coast ports. Fortunately, the strike only lasted 3 days. Workers received a 70% wage increase over the duration of the contract of 5 years. One last sticking point, however, is the continued automation at the ports. They have set a January 10th deadline to have this resolved, and they're working on negotiating that now. In spite of the strike only lasting 3 days, it still created a major disruption and backlog. This should be fully cleared up by the end of this month. Something that greatly helped BFS during this time was our investment in 8 millwork reloads that service these affected markets. 6 of these reloads were rolled out over the last 18 months. This was huge in enabling us to service our customers. As far as the crystal ball goes for future container rates, Southeast Asia is currently at $4,500 per container and is expected to fall between $2,000 to $2,500 by Q2 of 2025, driven by soft demand. That's almost back to the pre-COVID rates. However, for Brazil, we're expecting increased rates to the Gulf and East Coast to be around $6,200 per container and will eventually fall back to $4,000 by Q2 of 2025. Thanks for your time. And now I'll pass it over to Jeff Reddick, our VP of Supply Chain for Building Materials.
Hey, thanks, Brett. And hello, everybody. Hey, questions we're being asked out in the field have been around outlook on products now and what it could mean going forward if demand starts picking up. Currently, roofing and insulation are still unmanaged demand as they have been for the past few years. The good news is, though, that we do see some additional capacity coming in on with new facilities over the next 1 to 2 years from some of our key suppliers. And on the positive side, we have seen over the past few years where some of our key suppliers have added additional capacity in hopes of a pickup in demand. James Hardie, LP SmartSide, Trex, just to name a few. As well as within BFS over the past couple of years, we've added approximately 30 to 35% capacity in our BFS truss plants and another 12 to 15% capacity within our BFS door shops. And on the commodity front, our Vice President of Commodities, Matt Lufkin, gave us a high-level overview of what's going on. Currently, it's a balance of a lot of downtime at the mills for maintenance, as well as an average demand that's left the overall market pretty much flat. At the moment, we don't see a lot of change until demand starts to improve going forward. So for that demand outlook, we'll turn it over to Allie Wolf, the Chief Economist at Zonda. Allie?
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And hello, everyone. I am delighted to be here to go through the state of the housing market and wider economy. Now, as mentioned, I am Allie Wolf, the Chief Economist with Zonda, even though, Jeff, sometimes it also feels like I'm the Chief Economist at BFS, so I get it. But in case you're not familiar with Zonda, we are a housing data and consultancy firm. We track the entire building life cycle from raw land all the way up until the closing out of new home communities. Now, at Zonda, we track what's going on with new homes across the country, what's happening with land and lot development, and we roll all of that up into our published research reports. At Zonda, I run our economics department, which includes our national outlook, our building product outlook, and other reports as well. Today's presentation is based on our national outlook report, which looks at what is happening in the economy, what's happening with policy, and how does that vary across the country. Now, I have 40 minutes to get through 5 sections. If you're familiar with my presentation style, I pack a lot in and then I have to talk quickly to get through all of it. Today will be no different. We're going to start high level looking at the Federal Reserve and the economy, and then we'll think about what's happening in the broader market and how that plays into for sale housing trends, for rent activity, what's happening with remodeling, and then we'll finish. You guys are actually the first group to see our revised forecast that we just revised yesterday. Now, where I wanted to start today's presentation is by going back to a couple of the core data sets that we know influence our policymakers' decisions. The first of which is, of course, the labor market. And if you think about what has happened throughout this year, we've seen the unemployment rate rise up to 4.1%, but we've still added jobs even after the downward revisions at a pretty healthy rate. Our year-to-date average so far this year is averaging 200,000 jobs. That is down from 200 and almost 65,000, but again, a pretty healthy level. When you think about how the Federal Reserve is interpreting the labor market, we've heard directly from Jay Powell that he still views the backdrop as the labor market being at or near maximum employment. If you turn to inflation, there's a tricky thing about inflation where people and economists view it differently. So inflation by definition is the rate of growth. And so economists are celebrating that at least we're not looking at increasing inflation levels where we're talking 5 or 6 or 7% growth on a year-over-year basis. We're getting closer to that 2% target. From a human or people point of view, they're not really focused on that rate of growth. They're looking at where are prices today. And across the economy, we know that prices are still high, and we know that people are responding accordingly. There's select consumers that today are only purchasing essentials, they're buying fewer items, or they're ultimately shopping around to find the best deal. As the Federal Reserve steps back, looks at the labor market, looks at inflation, but really looks at the totality of the data across the economy, they're asking themselves, what is the right policy level? Now, remember, from the Federal Reserve's point of view, they can have policy that falls into 3 camps. They can have restrictive policy, which is what we have today, meaning the current policy level is holding the market down. We could have policy that is stimulative. That's what we saw in 2021, where the low interest rates were increasing growth. And we can have policy that is neutral. It's neither trying to grow the economy or hold the economy back. Right now, what we're hearing from the Federal Reserve is that their goal is to get the federal funds rate to this neutral level. The challenge is neutral is theoretical. There's not an exact number, but generally speaking, economists think neutral is between 2.5 and 3.5 for the federal funds rate. Now, remember, the federal funds rate is different than mortgage rates. The federal funds rate is interbank lending, but this is the main tool that the Federal Reserve can use to try to influence the economy. A lot of people are wondering what's next after seeing our 50 basis point cut in September. Well, we can turn to the Federal Reserve for their forecasts. And what the Federal Reserve publicly has said is that they anticipate the federal funds rate to be 4.4% by the end of this year, which suggests 2 25 basis point cuts, one in November, one in December. Depending on the election, maybe that turns into 1 50 basis point cut in December. When you look at 2025, the Fed is anticipating a further drop in the federal funds rate coming down to 3.4%. The Fed has 8 live meetings, which are meetings that they can make a policy decision at next year. We think that we'll see a combination of the Federal Reserve cutting rates, pausing, cutting rates, just taking in new information. Now, what's important is that the Federal Reserve is not always right. Their forecasts can often be wrong, but I think the big thing that they're telling us is to anticipate that rates are going to continue to trend down next year, assuming the data continues to follow the path that it has. If you think about how this translates to mortgage interest rates, our forecast for 2025 is that we average in the high 5s. And I will say, if you look across other firms, Zonda, but also Wells Fargo, Fannie Mae, the general consensus is this idea of a high 5% interest rate in 2025. Now, I felt a lot more comfortable about our mortgage interest rates when we were seeing interest rates head towards that point. But do remember that we've seen a lot of volatility in mortgage rates just over the past handful of months. So this is showing you the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. We're going back to June and July of this year when we were looking at interest rates averaging in the high 6s, low 7s. Starting in the end of July, we started to see that interest rates were trending down. And before the Federal Reserve did anything, before they cut rates, we had already seen mortgage interest rates get down to 6.1%. If you've heard the phrase that Fed rate cuts are quote unquote baked in to mortgage rates, this is your evidence that rates were dropping down before the Fed made a change. The tricky thing is, since the Federal Reserve cut rates, interest rates have only gone up. And that has confused a lot of people because that really goes against what you believe will happen. But remember that investors are the ultimate driver of mortgage interest rates. We have had a couple data releases that have shown the economy is stronger than initially expected. That puts some upward pressure on rates. We also got those new estimates of what would happen to the debt and deficit under both the Harris and Trump administrations, both of which will increase, at least according to the estimates, they will add to our national debt by a pretty high margin. And typically higher debt levels do also come with higher interest rates. And so I think investors are baking that in as well. I bring up all of this because we are still holding that interest rates could average that high 5 next year. But importantly, it's not a direct path down. There can be a lot of volatility, and lots of different announcements, economic announcements, policy announcements can influence mortgage rates one way or another. But of course, we care about interest rates because it influences housing demand. And right now, as you look across the housing landscape, we still have a lot of consumers that are sitting on the sidelines. They're nervous about the election. They feel that interest rates are likely to go down more in the future, so they want to wait. And affordability is still high and stretched across the US. We got new data yesterday that completely backed that up. If you tracked out that existing home sales report, the purple line is what we saw through September. Still just this slog in overall transactions. Right now, existing home sales on track for the lowest level since 1995. Now, there has not been much of a shift when it comes to existing home sales, but there has been a shift when you look at active listings. This is showing listings by month, by year. You can see that September has now come in with listings at the highest point we've seen in 5 years. When you look at listings on a year-over-year basis, we're up about 35%. But very importantly, if we think about this relative to a normal market, using 2019 as our example, we're still down about 25%. But there has been a big shift in the housing landscape just over the past 6 months where you could have said inventory is tight everywhere for the past few years. Now, when you talk about inventory, it absolutely is a localized story. So this map is showing you active listings compared to 2019 across top markets. The lighter the blue, the further these markets are from 2019 levels. So across California, across the Northeast, across Midwest, inventory is still down 20, 40, 60% compared to pre-pandemic. If you look at the markets that have the darker purple, those are markets where we have seen inventory actually rise compared to 2019. This is concentrated in parts of Florida, Texas, Colorado, Arizona, Utah. Now, as we've talked to our clients, some of them have been caught off guard with the idea that resale inventory has opened up a bit, has changed, because there's been so much talk about the lock-in effect. Why would anyone reset a lower interest rate? Well, what we know is that insurance costs and availability, higher property taxes, investors selling homes, people getting married, people getting divorced, people having children, those all have proven to be factors more powerful than the lock-in effect and has allowed for a little bit more mobility. Now, if we think about why we care about the changing resale market, part of it ties to remodeling activity. Generally speaking, we want to see more activity in terms of listings and sales to help drive more remodeling activity. But of course, we're watching this also from a builder point of view, because the big story in the housing market has been that new home builders have gained an advantage in terms of sales inventory. So every month this year, we've been talking to builders asking about the kind of competition they have found from the resale market. Right now, we have about 50% of builders that say very little competition. For context, earlier this year in January, that was 80% of builders saying very little competition. So as the year has gone on, we've seen builders say, hey, it's a little bit of competition or a moderate level. We basically have no builders saying that they're seeing strong competition right now. But we wanted to take this a step further. We had an event a couple weeks ago called our Dallas Dealmakers event. Builders, developers, suppliers all got in a room in Texas talking about the current trends. Now, we had a panel. Tim Sullivan at Zonda was moderating it with builders. And what Tim said to the builders is, okay, how are you guys interpreting the changes in the resale market? And there were two camps that emerged. Camp one were builders that were saying, hey, we welcome more supply because that means more mobility. When people sell homes, they have to buy homes. That's good for us. There was a different camp of a builder that said, hey, we are all in denial. Resale market is our biggest competitor. This market is changing, and it becomes worrisome in particular if sellers don't become buyers. So different ways to interpret it, but to me, I go back to sales. Okay, we know how they feel about the market. How has this influenced overall sales activity? The purple line is 2024, and the answer is not bad. We can see that, of course, September sales have come in lower than where they were in February, March, and April, but those are spring selling season months. There's a reason those are stronger months. If you look at the purple line relative to history, we're not finding anything abnormal about this year. In fact, we're seeing a pretty standard, pretty traditional seasonal market. But we like to take sales a step further. We do so with what is known as our ZMR, our Zonda market ranking, where we look at how sales look across the country, adjusted for supply and adjusted for seasonality. Nationally, we found the new home market came in as slightly overperforming for the 9th month in a row. When you look at how this varies across the country, any of the green dots are overperforming markets. That's 66% of the market today. Yellow are average, the red are our underperforming markets. Now, subscribers to Zonda's National Outlook can see this map for entry level, for move up, and for high-end projects as well. But if you're not a subscriber, the high level is that the entry level market today is still the slowest. The move up market today is the strongest. But I do want to acknowledge one thing about this map. If you're operating in a market that is green, in particular, a significantly overperforming, a dark green market, you may say that doesn't really match the sentiment on the ground. And that's an important caveat. What we're doing in the ZMR is just looking at transactions. We don't care how hard it is to sell a home. We don't care how expensive it is to sell a home. We're just looking at, do incentives, do price cuts actually result in a sale? If the market is green, the answer is generally yes. But the reason we'd have this disconnect is we know that incentives are still the name of the game of today's housing market, where builders are offering mortgage rate buydowns, funds towards closing costs, flex dollars. This is showing you the distribution of incentives across the country. Generally speaking, though not perfectly, you find that the more purple the dot, the higher the incentive use, tends to overlap with markets where we do also have more resale competition. As we talk about incentives, though, there are a couple key points that have come up fairly regularly with our clients. The first is the idea that incentives associated with a sale are becoming worrisome in the way that builders are saying we have to offer incentives at more communities or on more homes, or we're having to increase the incentive to have the same kind of effectiveness. We also are hearing from builders, though, the question of how do we wean consumers off incentives? Consumers come in today, they know incentives are out there, they negotiate for those incentives. How do we get consumers to pull back? And I think our answer is, if you look about the new home advantage versus the existing home market, incentives are one of the key reasons why builders are doing better. We don't see a huge affordability relief going into next year. And so we do still think as we go over the next 12 months, incentives are still going to be a big and important part of the backdrop. Now, the reason we spend time talking about sales is because sales influence starts. This is our second quarter housing starts data. Those that are subscribed to Zonda, next week, I think next Monday or Tuesday, you're going to get our third quarter housing starts data. But second quarter still gives you a pretty good sense of how the market's looking. So this is showing you our top 25 markets for housing starts across the country. I have bracketed out that year over year change, where as of the second quarter, every single one of the top markets has seen starts go up compared to last year. Importantly, 20 of the 25 top markets have also seen starts rise compared to 2019. If you think about some of the markets where starts are still down below 2019, I'd say there's two big themes that emerge. In some cases, it's somewhere like Denver, where builders don't feel overly positive that if they really ramp up starts, they're going to sell a whole bunch more homes. You also have markets like Seattle, where there is demand and there is interest, but there's these limitations on developable land and what kind of homes builders can sell and at what price. And so that's contributing to housing starts or slower housing starts activity than what we saw in 2019. But we wanted to take this a step further. So this is showing the here and now of housing starts, but we wanted to get a sense of how the top 25 markets have changed over the past 10 years. So here what you're looking at, any of the purple markets are in Texas, any of the green are in Florida, gray is everywhere else. So put simply, Texas and Florida represent 40% of our top production markets in the country. But I wanted to just look at the top 5 markets. So Dallas became the #1 production market in 2016, has held that spot since. Houston comes in at 2. Phoenix became the 3rd largest production market only in 2022, bumping Atlanta down. And for the first time in our data's history, San Antonio has come in at #5, coming in stronger than what we've seen in Austin. As you track out the top production markets, notice Washington, D.C. is the market that has moved the most. It used to be the 4th largest production market. Today, it's down to the 14th. But I know not all of you will be operating in these large markets, so we also wanted to show you what we call the next 25. The next 25 looks at markets that have between 2,000 and 6,000 housing starts. These are the markets that are ranked 26 through 50 in terms of overall production. Now, before I go into what stands out to me in the data, I do want to make a call out to places like Charleston, Columbus, Oklahoma City. These markets fall within the 30 to 40th biggest production markets in the country, but they're not shown in this table. That's because they're known as quote unquote expansion markets for us at Zonda. We don't have 10 years worth of history, so I don't want to include it as we look at that historical element. Here, as you view this graphic, the yellow markets will be in the mountain region, the blue will be in California, green in Florida, gray is everywhere else. What stands out to me, if you look at that 2024 column, I've put a bracket around some markets. Places like Port St. Lucie, Tucson, Fresno, Baltimore, Stockton, Albuquerque, Winston-Salem. These are some of the markets that have posted the biggest lift in terms of overall starts volume. These markets are not just concentrated in one region. As you go down the list, you're looking at Florida, Arizona, California, Maryland, North Carolina, New Mexico. But when you look at this, what was interesting to me is seeing more growth in some of these smaller, I'd say next tier markets versus places like Philadelphia, LA, New York, areas where they're really running into developable land limitations. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about the for sale market. And if you think about all price categories, maybe luxury being the exception, we are still finding that affordability is the limiting factor. And this brings us to a discussion of what we're seeing in the rental market. Right now, the rent versus own equation has tilted towards renting. It's more favorable to rent than own if you're just looking at the monthly payment nationally, which to me was a little bit surprising given how much rent growth we've seen, almost 30% rise in the effective rent since 2019. But of course, the difference between renting and owning comes down to mortgage rates. When you look at rents, though, rents can tell you a big story about what is going on across the country today, because nationally rents are coming in basically flat on a year-over-year basis. But there are 2 completely different rental markets that we're capturing in the data. One rental market that we would call it is the rental market that includes the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Midwest. These are parts of the country where we are still finding rents are rising on a year-over-year basis. And I would attribute the West and the East Coast to the idea of there's just not been a big ramp up in construction, so just not too much competition. In the Midwest, there is developable land. There has been a lot of growth, but rental rates relative to incomes are some of the best in the country. That allows for some household formation. That allows for still some upward pressure on rents. But then we need to look at the other side of the rental market. What are the key trends that we're seeing here? Well, these are the areas where we've seen rents go down on a year-over-year basis. You can see somewhere like Austin, we have rents down almost 8% compared to the prior year. If you track out these areas, these are Sunbelt markets. These are high growth areas. These are places where people have moved to, where employment numbers have trended up. But these are also areas where there has been a lot of new supply. And as that supply has come online, different than the for sale side, Because in the for sale side, you're bringing homes onesie, twosie, you're building them at a time. When you think about an institutionally managed rental complex, you're talking a big structure where a lot of the units get brought to the market at the same point. When you have a lot of these units hit, that has pushed rents down. Most areas, rents are still up from 2019, but at least year over year, they're down. And we're seeing higher use of concessions. Concessions, if you're not active in the rental market, think of that as the equivalent of an incentive that you would find on the for sale market. Concessions in the rental market today average 8% of rents. That's generally looked at as 1 month free. Concessions do vary across the country. Again, the markets that you're looking at here generally will have higher concession usage than in the Northeast, the Midwest, or in parts of California. But a lot of what's happening from a rental rate point of view does tie down to overall occupancy. So we're going to start with national occupancy, and then we'll show how this looks across the country. Let's go back to where we were going into the pandemic, where we saw a 96% occupancy rate. That was a high point. You can see that was the highest point we had seen going back to 2010. During the height of the pandemic, we got up to almost a 98% occupancy level. That's wild. At 98%, rents are going to be going up, new construction's going to be happening. It all makes sense. If you look at where we are today, we've basically moved from a record high with occupancies down to a 10-year low. We're at 94% on a national basis. Really, 95% is ideal. Not overly scary or alarming, but very much a localized discussion. So here we're showing you occupancies by market. The more purple the dot, the higher the occupancy. You will notice this looks very similar to the graph that we showed you with rental rates, where the Northeast, the Midwest, and parts of the West Coast have much higher occupancy levels versus the high growth areas. Some of the high growth markets right now, we're looking at occupancy 90, 92, 93%. And if you think about the relationship between occupancy and rents, Camden has a good rule of thumb that they talked about on their earnings call. Camden is a real estate investment trust that is building some of these apartment complexes. They say the key to being able to push rents and to have any pricing power at all is to maintain occupancy above 95%. So to me, you really have this clear story starting to form. But when you think about the rental market, let's think back to what I said about listings, that you can't make a blanket statement about listings. I also don't think you can make a blanket statement about the rental market, because there are some strong markets across the country, but for some of those softer markets along the Sun Belt, there's a very important caveat to all of this data. We do not believe it has to do with demand. We believe it very much has to do with supply. Let me tell you why we see that. This is looking at net absorptions, so space vacated versus space leased. 2021, again, no surprise, very high level of demand, lots of movement going on. If you look at 2024, with the exception of the pandemic, we're now at the highest level we've been in over 10 years. So still a lot of people looking to live in a rental project, lots of high levels of renewals, people staying in their rental complexes, but we are finding that in some markets, we're just working through that near-term supply. Again, this comes directly from the earnings calls. This is from UDR, who directly calls out that their Sunbelt markets do have more robust job growth than other parts of the country, but they remain cautious in the near term, given those absolute levels of supply. Equity residential really focuses on the same thing, still have good demand, but remain under pressure, continuing high levels of supply. You look at this, and then no one should be surprised why we are finding multifamily housing starts this year have slowed pretty dramatically, coming in below where we are with the historical average. Now, I'll talk about our forecast later. I'll give direct numbers and inflection points that we're looking for. But from a multifamily point of view, we do think in certain markets it's choppy now. We expect it to be choppy for the next few years, but we do see a lot of enthusiasm about what happens to multifamily housing starts as we go over the next, I'd say, 4 to really probably 5 to 10 years. Let me turn the discussion to remodeling, which kind of has a similar story, a similar backdrop to what we're finding in the rental space, which is right now is not the best it's been, But we do still hold to the idea of the golden decade for remodeling. We do still have enthusiasm about remodeling with a sooner inflection point for remodeling versus multifamily, meaning we're more enthusiastic about remodeling activity in the near term. We think that there is more of a shift that's going to happen over the next year. Now, first, I'd be remiss to not acknowledge the headwinds and some of the challenges that we're seeing right now in the remodeling space. One of them, a big one, is what we talked about earlier, which is just low mobility rates. Now, in some cases, a low mobility rate can be good for remodeling because that means you have people staying put and maybe they're frustrated and maybe they're going to invest on their home, especially given the equity that they have available to them. But we also know generally higher levels of existing home sales can also lead to higher levels of remodeling activity. Another headwind that we're tracking out is the story of the economy for the past handful of years has been that excess savings that people had during the pandemic. When you look at how that pandemic era savings has changed, we've now burnt through that excess savings. And so that was a big tailwind for the market, turning into a bit of a headwind right now. And we see this in the for sale market as much as we do in the remodeling market, the idea that rates will come down. We're calling it this deflationary mindset. Why would I make this in big investment now when I believe that interest rates will be lower in the future? So some pretty key headwinds that have already impacted inflation-adjusted spending. This is showing you home improvement activity. The black line is current. This is the reality. This is not a forecast. When you look at the black line relative to the red line, this is what our expert Todd Tomilak believes is going to happen. Now, I should step back. Everything I'm talking about in this section comes from Todd Tomilak. He's Zonda's building product expert. He puts out this amazing report every month called Building Product Outlook. So this is just me parroting back his information on what he's tracking in the remodeling space. But what Todd says is if you look at remodeling today, we have this black line that has come down. He thinks we are in a pretty classic version of a deferral then rebound pattern. So that purple line is Todd's forecast for remodeling spend. He thinks this shoots back pretty quickly. If you look at that shape and you think about economic recoveries, that's a pretty standard V-shaped recovery. But the analogy that Todd uses is that he believes right now we're just holding this beach ball underwater. So there's a lot of reasons why we're enthusiastic about the market. We talked about the headwinds. We're already seeing the market down. This beach ball is getting held down. At some point, you take your hand off that beach ball and you see that pretty rapid rebound. And that's Todd's thesis for remodeling. Now, I boiled down his key reasons that he's enthusiastic about this space into 5 reasons. The first is something that we've talked about before, but I think we need to continue keeping in the back of our mind, which is what we're calling festering dissatisfaction with where people live right now and what kind of choices are available to them. What Todd sees is that over time, we anticipate to see this wave, this increase of future moves of remodeling or both, of people saying, if I'm staying in this house, I'm going to invest money in it. If I'm moving, I'll probably get a higher return if I invest in the property. And so we do think that there will be an uptick that leads to and plays into that golden decade for remodeling thesis. The second big thing that Todd looks at is what has happened with owner equity. Now, if you look at the equity that people have accrued, we're looking at $12 trillion since 2020, which is equivalent to the size of 40% of our annual US GDP. These are massive numbers. And in a lot of cases, this has been untapped equity that Todd still feels very enthusiastic about, that people want to tap it, that people want to use it, especially when you combine it with number 3. This is looking at the change in the number of mortgage and HELOC accounts. And what Todd has calculated is that we've had more net mortgage and HELOC accounts added in the past 18 months than we have in the prior 10 years combined. Huge amount of what we're calling dry powder. Maybe people getting their ducks in the row saying, okay, we think that we're going to want to tap the equity. We think we are going to want to make that change. But again, going back to the deflationary mindset, you still just have people saying, now's not the right time, but the future should be. Number 4, and I should have said, Todd is a mathematician. So for him, he sometimes just looks for what is logical, what just makes sense. And so Todd has looked at the entire owner-occupied housing stock and looked at how that has changed. And he sees that the average number of bathrooms has grown 15% over the past 10 years. And so what Todd says is this change alone mathematically drives kitchen and bath project spending higher over the next 5 years versus where we were a decade ago, without any other kind of change to the replacement cycle. So he says, just look at math. To him, this feels like an almost no-brainer. And then you go to reason number 5. This is something I've talked about on this webinar before. If you see me present in the future, I'm still going to talk about it, which is the aged housing stock. Nationally, the oldest housing stock on record. This is showing you how housing stock varies by market. The lighter the blue, the older the housing stock. The more saturated the blue, the younger the housing stock. And you can't even make any direct conclusions about, okay, that means, New York has an older housing stock than Jacksonville, so that means way more remodeling activity. We don't think that's necessarily the case. You just have different kinds of remodeling needs as you look at the age of the housing stock. Right now, a lot of the darker blue markets actually fall into our prime remodeling years because they're at the point that maybe the house is looking dated, maybe the roof needs adjusted, different factors like that. When you roll all of this together, this is Todd's forecast for remodeling. He breaks it out by minor, mid, and major. He sees the rest of this year still quite choppy. Into next year, probably still choppy. You could see some green shoots, but he doesn't think it's blockbuster to begin 2025. But as we go through the end of 25 and into 2026, Todd does have very positive forecasts. He thinks we get past some of this uncertainty, even if rates don't plummet down, which most people aren't expecting, seeing a little bit of that certainty in rates, seeing them come down a little bit, he does believe will be very positive for overall remodeling spend. So at this point, we've covered our mortgage rate forecast, we've covered our remodeling forecasts. Now I want to bring us back to the multifamily side and the single family side to finish our thoughts here. So let's go to the multifamily side. This comes from the National Multifamily Housing Council, where they talk to developers and basically say, why are housing starts down this year? So the number one reason that a developer will say is that a project is not economically feasible, followed by economic uncertainty. If you look at tied for number 3, you have the availability of construction financing. I think the availability of construction financing and the project is not economically feasible really go hand in hand. Sometimes it's the availability of financing, sometimes it's the cost of that financing. But the other key reason comes down to permitting and entitlement services, how those are taking longer and costing more money. I'd put this in even more simple terms. When we think about what is happening in the rental side right now, in some markets we talked about there's a lot of supply going on. There's still high interest rates, which play into borrowing costs of getting new projects done. We are not seeing as much inflation or as much of an increase in costs, but costs are still very high. That ties back to the first slide we talked about in today's presentation. Rents in some places going down, concessions in some places going up. There's uncertainty in the economy, and we still have these delays. To me, it makes perfect sense when you combine all of those, why there's just not an high amount of enthusiasm on the rental side today. Our revised forecast, again, you guys are the first people to see this. We've actually revised it slightly down. We've been pretty consistent with our multifamily forecasts for 2025. We do still think next year just feels like a slog, not seeing much of an improvement when it comes to new starts. Again, we turn to the developers. Camden on their earnings call said that starts could look just over 200,000 as we go into 2025. So not much enthusiasm for starts. But remember that there's a big difference between starts and completions. So completions continue to come in near a 30-year high. A lot of the units that were started over the past few years are coming online now. We do still think that completions remain high throughout this year, continue to be high in 2025, probably start to taper off towards the end of 2025. But we, at least with our forecasts, we are calling for the rebound year to be in 2026, where you do see a bit of a lift in overall starts. We don't think it's a huge number just based on the timeline. We have an expert in the multifamily space. Her name is Kimberly Byram. And Kimberly put together this amazing graphic that looks at if you were to start different types of apartment complexes today, how long would it take for them to get delivered? And we know that not a lot of companies are working on those starts right now. But what she saw is if we started today, got in the pre-development phase today, we're looking at 2027 for some of the earliest points of completions. So we think this part of the market remains a little bit choppy as we think about 2025, a little bit of a rebound in 2026, and then we feel more comfortable about what the world looks like, to the best extent that we can in 2027 and 2028. As you turn to the single family side, one thing we like to do is talk to builders. And so in our builder survey, we say to builders, what are your plans for overall housing starts? What we find is that the majority of builders do anticipate starting more homes next year versus this year. That does fall in line with the general consensus among economists. We actually, given our forecast, we actually have come in at the highest of some of the firms that I look at right now. We are calling for, I think our number is about 3% growth in single family housing starts next year. The consensus that I'm seeing is about 1 to 3%. I think there could be some lift to the upside, but obviously still some risks that we're watching here as well. If you think about why economists and builders feel enthusiastic about the market, part of it comes down to land and lot supply. We are releasing our new land and lot data also in the coming weeks, and we anticipate that that's going to be a little bit higher than where we were. Not flush with lots, but better in particular than 2021, for example. We already talked about mortgage rates. I haven't seen any forecaster say 3 or 4% interest rates come back anytime soon, but I think any kind of compression in interest rates would be helpful to the consumer and to have some consumers feel more comfortable entering the market. And then we have the idea of pent-up demand. Some people that have chosen to go on the sidelines because of the election, some people waiting for a little bit of affordability relief. We do still think affordability is a key issue, but we do believe as we go into next year, a little bit more enthusiasm from the consumer as we have more clarity around the Federal Reserve, as we have more clarity around the election. Wild cards, I'd be remiss to not talk about them. Of course, we're watching affordability. We're tracking out the insurance market. We're watching for what we call the end of the Great Migration, where you do still have movement patterns, but nothing like what we saw in 2020, 2021. We're tracking consumer confidence in the economy. Of course, we always do, we always will be. But assuming everything goes the way that we're looking at it right now, we do believe that the spring selling season of next year should look, I wouldn't say strong, but I'd say better than what some people are expecting right now. So with that, I will stop here. Jack, let me bring you in from BFS to look at some of the questions.
Thanks, Allie. Hey guys, Jack Mannon here from the marketing communications team for Builders FirstSource. Yeah, we got a couple questions that have come in. For anyone who has been following along here and you haven't had a chance to submit a question yet, feel free to use the chat feature in the right side of your screen, and questions will be answered in the order that they appear. Question that came in is the devastation throughout the Carolinas. What effect will we see on building materials in the Southeast? Either disruption or unplanned extra use required for rebuilding?
So let me step in and answer that question. This is Brett Dewey. From the millwork perspective, we're not expecting any immediate impact from that. There's lots of capacity on windows and the millwork category itself. We all know that shingles have already been difficult on allocation in large part. So that will continue to be tight. So Jeff's in my office. What else would you like to address?
No, just as you started out, as Amy mentioned, the devastation down there was pretty impactful and pretty severe. It's going to be a while before we can get to rebuilding down there. It might put a little strain on siding, shingles, insulation, gypsum, but it's going to take a while for the whole area to be reset. For construction to be approved or insurance to get in. So at the moment, we're not probably going to see an impact, Jack.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff and Brett.
One of the questions was, can you please share how the data for 2024 aligned with your predictions, particularly excluding any unexpected events? This person did not know. They were giving me a shameless plug for our building product outlook. We just put out a report this week to our clients that we went through. So for our forecasting process, if you're not familiar with what we do, we look at what is likely to happen in the economy, in the housing market, in the remodeling space. And Todd Tomalak and I develop, and the rest of our team, develop our probabilities. So we will say, hey, we think that the forecast is, and I showed you our different forecasts, we will then provide people with a probability of that. So, we're saying 340,000 multifamily, we have X level of confidence in that. And then we tell our subscribers why and what could make the data go right or wrong. So I actually just did a LinkedIn post today that as we went through our forecasts, we were more right than wrong on most things. Yes, of course, there's unexpected events, and and that's why the probability is not 100%, is that these unexpected events will come in. But we ended up pretty much nailing single family housing starts, multifamily housing starts, Fed rate cuts, the trajectory of mortgage rates. I think the biggest thing that we got wrong, because we didn't get everything right, is that we did expect a little bit more of a demand boost this year versus what we got, in particular when it came to the existing home market. We did think we were going to come up from bottom, and as you saw in the chart, we still hadn't fully come up from that. One question that I see here talks about the hurricanes and the impact on the markets. So you heard about the impact on the supply side from the BFS team. And I don't like to answer some of the questions about the hurricanes without coming, I think it can come off a bit insensitive, but I will say that one of the things that we have heard is from some of the builders that we've talked to in parts of Georgia, in parts of the Carolinas, obviously the ones that were not impacted by the hurricane, those areas have reported to us that they've seen higher levels of traffic from people in Florida potentially considering leaving the state. And so that could have, again, don't want to use something bad for something good, but we have seen maybe some shifts in migration patterns, or at least thoughts of people considering living elsewhere, maybe because of the storms, but also just maybe because of the costs associated with the storm.
Allie, I'm sending you some more questions for your review.
If you think back to traditional recession indicators, this question is about the SOM roll, but also the 10 and 2 yield curve. Traditionally, people would say when you have the inversion of the 10 and 2, that's basically a guarantee of a recession. And we've seen that had gotten uninverted recently, but it had been triggered for a really long time, and obviously no recession. The other big thing is the SOM rule. If you're not familiar with this, the SOM rule was developed by Claudia Sohm. She was a former Federal Reserve economist, and she had developed a methodology that if the unemployment rate had risen by over 0.5% compared to the past 12 months, that a recession was, again, basically a guarantee. The SOM rule had been triggered, I think, a couple months ago. We had talked about this with our clients. Claudia herself did say that she believes this time is different. She talked about some of the immigration patterns, some of the productivity patterns. She also talked about how the unemployment rate was so abnormally low because of the pandemic and some of the spending and the changes in the economy, that she doesn't believe it's as good of an indicator as it was in the past. But the SOM rule had been accurate every single year dating back to the 60s. So yeah, we're watching that. We're tracking not just the SOM rule. I think once the SOM rule flags, it just tells you to look at other things in the economy. We are continuing to do that, but yeah, I mean, I think what we've learned is the power of stimulus. The stimulus that was passed under both administrations, the Trump and the Biden administration. When you flood so much money into the system, it can make data look a little bit tricky. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why some of those traditional indicators aren't working. Jack, I'm going to see if there's any questions for BFS as I continue to catch up. So let me turn it to you, see if there's anything you want to hit on.
You bet. Thank you for the engagement, everyone. A question we're getting a lot on our side is, hey, when will this presentation be available? Yes, it will be available, both the presentation itself as well as a recording. Our goal is to get that out in the next 2 business days. So if not tomorrow, then Monday at the latest.
I see one question, Jack, on the passage of rent control. Okay, yeah, so this question is, will the passage of rent control in California, Prop 33, affect new apartment starts? We as Zonda, as a rule, are very much against rent control. We do believe that if you look at history, when you do have rent control go into play, it does normally lower overall apartment starts, and it results in a deterioration of the quality of apartments that are already built. Just my answer is we are absolutely not for rent control. We do think it has a negative impact on the overall housing market. There's a question here for the BFS teams. What is traditionally the percent breakout of material costs that flow into multifamily, single family, and remodeling? Given the reduction in multifamily and the slight increase in single family, what is your overall outlook for building materials demand? So I think that's probably better for someone on the BFS team to answer.
Yeah, Allie, Brett and I will try to jump in on that one real quick. And I saw there was another question is, what's the outlook on pricing around building products? They both kind of go hand in hand. Most of the suppliers are out there signaling for Q1 of 25 that we're going to see an average cost of living increase of 3 to 5% to cover wages, to cover increased fuel costs, and everything else that we're continuing to see rise across the economy with inflation. So I'm not sure we're going to see any relief from the less demand in multifamily as it shifts over to single family. A lot of the suppliers will right size their production capacity to meet the demand out there. On the commodity side, as I kind of mentioned earlier, it is all around demand and output, and it's going to be balanced back and forth right now until we see an increase in demand out there.
Jack, I can take one more and then I'll turn it back to you to close it. The question was, how is the new home inventory situation in Texas and Florida? So I had talked about the rise in resale supply in those markets. And so it is a good kind of natural next question. The tricky thing that's happening in parts of the country is, as many of you know, builders have intentionally pivoted to building more spec homes. So traditionally, in particular in 2022, as the housing market was slowing, we just looked at quick move-ins, and that was our kind of slam dunk guide of, okay, quick move-ins have come down, which means that quick move-ins have gone up, which means that builders are now sitting with a lot more inventory. Quick move-in homes are a lot higher than where they were in many parts of Texas and Florida. But if you talk to the builders, they'll say we're intentionally building spec homes. So I'd say the true answer to that is hard to unpack unless you do on-the-ground conversations. I had dinner with a builder in Texas recently that said they're a smaller builder, but they said, hey, we have 8 standing inventory homes that we can't sell. You're certainly hearing of some conversations about a little bit of a buildup in standing inventory, but no one's saying, oh my gosh, this is alarming, this is scary, this is really going to change what our 2025 looks like.
Thank you, Allie. And that's probably going to take us to the hour, folks. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's event. Thank you to everyone who attended all 3 of our webinars this year with Zonda. So really appreciate your time. Appreciate Allie Wolf lending her expertise in the greater BFS supply chain team, Amy and Tim as well. Again, we'll be sending out a copy of the presentation here in the next 2 business days, and we hope you'll join us next year. If we continue to do, I hope we do, these webinars, and hope everyone has found them to be as valuable as I have. So thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your week.